So what are the major distinctions between what we're calling practitioner-based research and academic-based research? So we've identified sort of two major areas that we think that makes each one of these areas distinctive. So one is thinking about the motivations behind producing research. So in terms of producing research in the academic discipline, the motivation, I argue, starts with the person who's producing it, so the scholar or the faculty member, right? So you have a particular question, a research agenda, a particular sort of form of training that you decide to approach a question related to a topic because sort of that's where you fit, right? So, and your motivation behind producing a piece of work is in establishing a name for yourself, in establishing yourself as an expert in a particular topic. So that's where the motivation for producing academic-based research really comes from. On the flip side, maybe you can talk about the motivation for producing research in practice.
Well, I think in practice, as well as in the policy sphere, namely, it's if there are dollars to support that work, and those dollars are typically coming from a foundation or potentially the National Endowment for the Arts. But really, it's client-based, not necessarily driven, or in very rare circumstances, is it driven from an organization's perspective or from any other means. Even if it is an organization-driven notion, oftentimes they seek foundation funding to make it happen.
Right. So there's a difference in motivations behind the research. But even within the fields themselves, there's differences in the type of research that you see.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a key distinction, and Norman Bradburn put out a nice paper about a year ago, really talking about there's a notion of what kind of questions should you ask. Big, broad questions about connecting arts and culture to other aspects of life and society. Should arts organizations exist? Should there be fewer? Big questions about how things connect. And then there's a question related more specifically to field work regarding the NEA's research agenda about how art works. Questions about how do you improve practice within arts organizations? How do you foster creativity or the experimentation of program, etc., of learning how to make things function and improve those functionalities within the current arts sphere. So there's a real distinction between kind of policy and then I think the notions of kind of normative and positive research within kind of the practice sphere. And did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so and also within practice too, we see different types of research being produced as well. So we have research that is being produced in order to help with organizational effectiveness. So say, for example, an organization is in the middle of a strategic planning process. The first kind of step that you do in strategic planning is to do an audit of what the external environment looks like that may be impacting the operations of your organization. The first thing that usually organizations do is they go out to see what kind of reports or literature already exists that can help them understand what external factors are affecting them. Then they go back and take a look at, what questions haven't we answered with what's already been produced, and how can we get the answers to those questions? Well, now we have to produce some primary research, and for this, we'll usually hire a consulting firm, right? So that's when you see focus groups taking place, things like in-depth interviews taking place, organizations trying to understand what factors may be influencing them and affecting them, but that's directly related to their own questions. And so that's sort of one area of research that you see being produced in the practice-based field. So the other area of research is sort of what we would term as like advocacy research, right? So advocacy research, the primary motivation behind it is to help with resource attraction. So you might see things like economic impact studies being produced by local municipalities, and this is sort of to help make the case that what a local municipality is doing deserves funding or deserves resources. So there's that area of research as well. And then there's another area of research that you see being produced in practice, and this is what I would sort of term as sort of descriptive level research that might help facilitate other type of research. So a lot of the research that you see the NEA doing, for example, is research that goes in, that looks at sort of all of that provides a lot of different descriptive statistics about the arts and cultural field in general. So they might have identified a new data source that has information on artists. So they'll go through and they'll mine that data source and produce all of the different types of statistics that one who's interested in those data might want to know. So it's a very sort of descriptive level research. So I even think within practice-based research, we see different types of research going on. I think this is probably the same in academic-based research. So we see sort of our more targeted or narrowly defined sort of scholarly research, papers in journals, things like that we're used to reading and hearing if we work in academia. But then academics are also kind of putting a foot in different areas as well. So they might decide to write a book, and depending on what field you come from, a book is looked at better or worse than others. The book might be produced by a academic press, and that's different than a book being produced by a commercial press. And the tone and style of that book and the research that is within that book is a little bit different. So even within academic-based cultural and arts research, there are different types of research going on as well. There's also then this issue of peer review. And obviously, research that's coming out of the academic sector usually has to go through some sort of peer review, in that you submit a paper to a journal, and then you have a number of referees read it and then send it back, and hopefully if it gets accepted, it gets you have to address comments for clarity, things like that. So there's there's this institutional mechanism in place that academics have in order to make sure that research is generally of high quality and that answers questions in the ways that it should be. Now, it's a little bit more informal in the practitioner-based field.
There's no peer review, really. That's not required. But I think the key challenges that I wrestled with is that, yes, I was based and compensated through a for-profit consulting firm. The type of work that I did there tended to be policy focused, or was very public in nature. Others produce works that are for a specific client. It only travels to the client, etc. And from my observations and experience, there's a lot of interesting ideas and empirically based ideas that are being generated from folks outside of the academic sphere who are not bound to IRB. They are not evaluated based on publications or the institutional structures that surround a university or an academic position. And that information travels to practitioners most often because it's not necessarily behind the firewalls, the barriers of accessing journals, etc., or it's directly related to a practitioner audience, or putting that information into play. But there are questions about how, particularly since the arts field is moving more toward the need of data and information, looking towards systems of information that tend to be well established in the academic sphere. How can we integrate the information and knowledge sharing that is incredibly rich between these two spheres, but are not necessarily traveling and being heard in this information exchange? So trying to think, so regardless, or given these institutional barriers and motivations, how do we cross those lines to assist each other kind of with various notions of expertise?
Right. And so there have been initiatives going on to actually help facilitate information exchange. So we've seen a number of networks now pop up among cultural researchers that There's a variety of different things that go on with these networks, but the main sort of idea behind them is actually to bring a group of people together to talk more and to share information, essentially. There's also sort of within these networks or within other different types of forums, there's actually been initiatives to help with education, so helping basically people understand the research that's coming from both fields. So the Cultural Policy Center's initiative Digest is actually a great example of this type of initiative that is helping basically to take academic-based research on arts and cultural policy and then make it more accessible to the broader public. So there are initiatives that are coming up and trying to actually facilitate information exchange, but I think the question that we have and that we wanted to really brainstorm today was sort of how can we aid in those types of initiatives, and how can we actually help with greater information exchange taking place?
Mm-hmm. What I sense is there's momentum around kind of two veins. There's kind of a supply side of information and research, and then there's a demand side for information and research. And I think that there is a growing need for informed decision making within organizations around trying to figure out making use of the research that's out there. We're talking about the various nodes of supply and how to connect those so that there's increased and embolstered supply of research that's relevant to the practitioners. So we're trying to figure out how can those different nodes be connected, and then as well as how can that bridge between the practitioners, be they organizations, individuals, etc., be bridged better.
So we obviously have, there's a large public discourse going on right now about the ways in which we use arts and culture in urban development strategies and regional planning strategies. And a lot of questions about whether or not it's useful, whether or not it actually works, whether or not it's having negative effects as opposed to positive effects. So it seems to me that one of the opportunities we have for facilitating information exchange is that we actually need to put a clear set of questions on the table, right? So we need to sort of, thinking about those policymakers who are on the ground and making those planning decisions, it would be great to actually understand what questions they need answered, right? And then on the flip side of that, being somebody who's interested in this type of work, so practitioners and policymakers need people to then be able to answer those questions. And I think there's actually a lack of there's actually not a lack of people who can answer those questions. There's a ton of people who can answer those questions, but ways in which we're fostering the development of those people. So focusing on how we can actually foster the development of researchers and academics who can then provide the answers to those questions in the arts and cultural policy field. So that's one of the solutions that I see that can help with information exchange across the two sectors.
One thing I've been thinking about, and this stems from some models that I've seen in the UK for science funding and a few models elsewhere, is identifying those clear questions. They can be big, broad, ugly questions. And then basically the ideas are thrown out there and say, great minds, come gather around and put your best ideas forward, and it could be a very eclectic group of individuals with varying perspectives, but that the collective knowledge is really what's generated, regardless of if you're from a university, independent contractor, consultant of some sort from within an arts organization, or someone who's on the ground, but bring the best minds who are interested in that sphere of idea generation and who can provide the ideas to do that. So be it either research agendas, not the right word, I don't think, but it's kind of what are the key pressing issues that are affecting arts and cultural policy. Now that's a big, broad beast of a banner to put ideas under, but it's really kind of gather great minds and those interested in generating public knowledge around a notion or a big question.
Right. It's also interesting to note that there's a difference between a problem statement and a research question. And I think I believe that it's very important before you start any type of research to identify what the problem is. And I think that's, so I'm just going to go out and say, I think that step is being skipped a lot in a lot of arts and cultural research. So rather than identifying, the fact that we don't see arts and culture in regional planning actually benefiting all communities, and why, and then stemming the question from that, why is that necessarily the case? So we're skipping that part of the research process and then jumping into what are the benefits of cultural districts and arts and culture and regional planning. But if we kind of take one step back and we say, well, here are all the problems that we see, and then what questions stem from that, we might see different types of research being produced. I just think so I always, at my job at the NEA, I had a big, so my colleagues made fun of me for this, but I had a big sign on my desk, and it said in bold letters, "What is your problem?" So I looked at it every single day. And it was, so I, as a researcher, always wanted to approach the work that I did as solving a problem. And when we see, advocacy-based research and other types of research where there's not necessarily a problem that the research is trying to identify, goes about, I think, doing the research in a different way because of that.
So we were brainstorming about if we designed a convening, because I feel like you have to get people in the same room. We have virtual networks and they're fantastic, but you need people in the same room to knock this out. But inviting the academics, which you're now the representative person, the practitioners, the policy folks, kind of what are the key questions? Now learn from each other. What are the disciplines that you can exchange? Also, who's that unusual person who doesn't do anything with arts, but who might have a new and interesting perspective or ask the right interesting questions? But to be less insular, I think, in our research approach, and less insular in terms of the communication strategies. So if once every 2 years we have some sort of "Are you interested in arts? Come ask hard questions" conference, that's the title of it. We come together, exchange ideas, but then we also all disappear or go back into our day-to-day routines. But there's this connection, and that's kind of really how fields form. And I think we're there. It's just a matter of getting people in the same room to exchange ideas.
Well, and to help make them feel welcome and invited. Mm-hmm. One of the ways we started the Cultural Facilities Project here at the CBC because we were hearing from consultants and foundations that there was a problem with overbuilding, that they thought there was a problem with overbuilding facilities in the cultural sector. Our entire research objective came from practice. So this is Jennifer's and I kind of attempt at starting the conversation among a small group of people, and then we are hoping to evolve this discussion in other forums. So we're presenting a panel on just this very topic at a conference in May, and with a larger group of people, and we're hoping to kind of really start to spark some dialogue about this idea of what are the barriers that are present between that are preventing information exchange from taking place, and what can we do in order to help facilitate that information exchange. And I absolutely agree that one of the biggest things that we can do is to figure out a way in which that we can invite more people to the table and learn from those people. And I mean, we're a small field, but we could be bigger. That's what I think. We could have more than, the two blogs in arts and cultural policy that we all read and know who the people are and mm-hmm. Who's working where and who's moving where. I mean, we could be a lot bigger. Mm-hmm. These are issues that I look at the arts and culture as policy. I don't look at the arts and culture as arts and culture. I look at it as policy. And I think that really sort of So in producing the work that I do in the academic sphere, I actually aim all of my work in non-arts and culture oriented journals to try to get it out there a little bit. So I look at journals for nonprofit management and urban policy and planning and things like that. So I look at it as policies that affect our sort of everyday way of life and just as being a person.
I said mine is kind of my take on this is trying to think about what kind of systems can be put into place to facilitate or to help. Even if people are out there and interested in the research, if the data is not available or of high enough quality, can the arts stand on their own or be in communication with other policy fields? So that's been my particular aspect on this thus far, is how can we share kind of data and learnings beyond kind of the individual and client communication, what can be shared in more broadly, as well as the systems in place for data and access to data and information to support the various knowledge exchanges. So if you have any comments or questions or what needs to be discussed, yes.
I think further augmenting the ability for the information to travel and having somebody continually and rapidly translating the research and the conversations for a general public. Because it seems to me that if you want to affect policy, you also have to affect public dialogue, and not just among policymakers, but again amongst people that care about an issue but maybe aren't experts in it. And so, like you said, expanding beyond those two blogs, and making things a bit more accessible to average people.
Well, it's nice to have a group of people who come from a policy school. And again, just because the way that your comment that you just made actually reflects to me that, you think about, you're here studying at the Harris School and that you're thinking about, maybe you're not. Oh, well.
I work for an arts organization.
Or an arts, well, that's interesting. Okay, I'm completely wrong then. But anyway, it's thinking about sort of how policy can affect the discourse and then aligning that with arts and culture, as opposed to how arts and cultural research can help affect the discourse in the arts and cultural field. So to think of it again, I'm a big advocate for making it something bigger than what it is right now.
Mm-hmm. Agreed, because that's my perspective too, and part of my RAND experience. You may not think arts and military go together, but just think about how are the arts infused in all aspects of various policy interests and needs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that's what we were just going to end with, sort of a brainstorm and dialogue about bridging the gap. But again, this is just the beginning of what we hope to be a longer conversation. There's a lot of strength in the field right now that's, I think, sort of progressing. It's a field that is, I don't know, I feel like, and maybe this is just because I'm in the beginning part of my academic career, but I feel like everybody's just coming around and trying to figure out ways in which to make the field stronger and better. And I don't know if this went on in sort of generations past. I wasn't around then, but I think it's a really important dialogue to have, and one to be really honest in as well.
My sense is that there is a either reinvigorated energy or more people or more vocal individuals. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's definitely an increased interest and need in this area, and it's just trying to figure out how do we organize or facilitate that energy to make sure that it's being productive and get information and learnings out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, everybody. Yeah.